had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, episode 250, brought to you by Endure IQ's training squad, Pogo Physio, and the Physical Performance Show's Learn-Ins membership. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. And of course, we do this across a range of different episodes, expert editions, featured performers, coaches' corners, and interest editions. And it's that time of year where, on the Physical Performance Show, we look back at the calendar year and we review some of the highlights of our expert editions and also our featured performers. Now, we're starting our annual review this year with looking back at our expert editions. Now, in prior years, we've labelled this episode the best of, where we've sourced feedback around popular episodes that really struck a chord with the learnings that were shared. However, this year, we've just looked straight at the data, that is the number of downloads per episode. And get set today as we review the top 10 most downloaded expert editions of 2020. I normally thank the supporters of the show at the end of the episodes. However, this has been such a challenging year for everyone around the world. So I want to shout out and say a massive thank you for your support of the Physical Performance Show. Where a lot hasn't gone right in our lives in 2020, it's always a delight and an extreme pleasure to learn of people, coaches, practitioners, and athletes of all levels being able to extract learnings and inspiration from the show episodes. In 2020, the show has been downloaded in excess of 560,000 times across 114 countries. So a massive thank you. And more recently, we launched the Physical Performance Show's Learn-Ins membership, where those that feel inclined to support the production of the show can support the show for $5 per month over at Patreon. And a big shout out to our new Physical Performance Show patrons, Wade Wallace, Australian-based, and incidentally, founder of Cycling Tips. If you are into your cycling, be sure to check out the awesome output of Cycling Tips over on Instagram and beyond. Big shout out to Samantha Brown, longtime show supporter, hailing from the UK, and Australian-based Jeff Marsh. Thank you, team, for supporting the show. And of course, 2020 was the year that through necessity, we launched the Physical Performance Show's live stream events to dive deeper into specific topics, all designed to maximize your learnings and pursuit of your physical best. And in 2020, we hosted Dr. Stephen Seiler, forefather of polarized training for endurance athletes, for his very popular Sustainable Training for Attainable Endurance Goals live stream. Originally, we were set to bring Dr. Stephen Seiler down under. Obviously, COVID changed that, and instead we held the event via a live stream, and it attracted hundreds of athletes, coaches, and practitioners worldwide. Dr. Seiler was followed by very popular prior guest of the show, Dr. Shona Halson, for her live stream event, Recovery Essentials for Optimal Performance. And both live stream recordings are available by way of a webinar over at Pogo Physio. Of course, if you are a Physical Performance Show Learn-Ins member, Patreon supporter, then you can receive access to the webinars free of charge. All right, it is time to reveal the Physical Performance Show's top 10 most downloaded expert editions for 2020. And kicking off the countdown as the 10th most downloaded expert edition is sport nutrition scientist Dr. Patrick Wilson, author of The Athlete's Gut. And on this expert edition, episode 231, Patrick explored gut physiology, anatomy, the trainability of the gut, FODMAPs, and how to overcome those distressing gut issues we can have during training and on race day. Here's a little snippet of Patrick sharing on the common gut ailments that athletes encounter and how to get on top of them.
So that's one of the things that I really wanted to convey with the book, is that when people say gut issues or gut distress, it's not all the same thing, obviously. But sometimes these problems get lumped together. But I would say there's probably, 7, 8, 9 common symptoms or issues that athletes might deal with. If you kind of start from the top down, we're usually talking about nausea and vomiting, reflux, regurgitation, heartburn, which tends to affect the esophagus and the upper stomach, fullness and bloating, which can be more of a stomach problem. You've got abdominal cramping, which can be in the upper or lower, but it tends to be more in the lower half of the gut. Side stitching, which many runners and athletes are familiar with that problem. You've got obviously urges to use the loo. You have loose stools. You've got also constipation on the other end, which isn't as common in athletes or runners, but you still sometimes see that among a subset of athletes. Bloody stool or diarrhea. That's kind of a list of 7 or 8 there that are fairly common among athletes. And the interesting thing is that they can have similar causes, or in many cases the causes can be completely different. So like if you have an athlete who's struggling with bloating or gas or loose stools, the solution to that problem is perhaps going to be different than if they're struggling with nausea and heartburn or reflux. The origins of those problems can be completely different. So you want to kind of track what's going on in the athlete's diet, daily life, to see, okay, are there certain things that are specific to these problems that I can address, as opposed to trying, saying, okay, what's the one thing I can do that fixes everything, which is not likely going to be realistic for most athletes. There isn't going to be one thing that you do that fixes your gut problems. It's going to be probably specific to the issues that you're experiencing.
And by the sounds of that, Patrick, multifactorial.
Yes. That's one thing that consistently, when I've done a number of kind of survey studies with athletes, and you try and correlate whether it be age or experience or training intensity or diet, psychological aspects like stress and anxiety, sleep habits, try and correlate that with gut symptoms. The correlations are always pretty small. Now, some of them are significant, meaning you can kind of say that they're real, but they're usually not, they're rarely ever strong, which kind of says that for any given symptom, there's likely to be multiple things involved. It's not going to be just one factor that determines whether somebody has a problem. And because of that, what I would say is that in most situations, to get a good handle on gut issues, oftentimes you have to take a multi-pronged approach to try to solve them. Now, some cases it is as simple as like, hey, I just ate a giant burrito before I went and ran, 45 minutes beforehand. That's like, okay, that's an easy fix. But in many cases, it's not going to be that easy. There's going to be a multitude of things you might want to look at, from stress to sleep to your diet, as just starting points.
So that was Patrick Wilson in 10th position, episode 231, an episode devoted to exploring the athlete's gut. Now, coming in 9th position, the 9th most downloaded expert edition of 2020, we have UK-based sports psychiatrist Dr. Emmett Mystery. And this episode, which aired in August of 2020, was really timely. The episode was focused on athletes' mental health, and it was an expert edition that really struck a chord given the difficult times athletes and indeed the population worldwide were experiencing through 2020. It's a super important expert edition where Dr. Emmett Mystery shared around depression and anxiety in athletes, the role of perfectionism in sport, resilience, and the why behind the publication of his book Case Studies in Sports Psychiatry. One of the topics discussed that really hit a chord was that of exercise addiction. And here's a little snippet of Dr. Emmett Mystery sharing around the characteristics of exercise addiction in athletes. What's the difference between being committed and dedicated and disciplined to being, as you say, contributing to potential pathology and you said, if I got it right, that the difference is, one, you're not no longer exercising for the rush, but you're fearful of the effects of withdrawal.
Yeah.
Gosh, that's challenging.
I think it's a great. I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of what do we define as normal and what's abnormal. And I think the nature of endurance sport is an extreme, and I think we've redefined what excellence is and what the pursuit of excellence is in endurance sport. I think 20 years ago, if you complete a marathon, that would be a level of success. But that's no longer the baseline. I think now it's about ultra marathons, 24-hour endurance. We are kind of pushing what we define as success in endurance. And I think there is a certain characteristics about endurance sport, and I think you questioned it really well about, well, is that a personality trait or not? And I think we talk about perfectionism in elite sport, and it is a double-edged sword, because having those traits, so being obsessive, very disciplined, conscientious, if you apply those traits to certain aspects of life, so for example, career, we can really excel. The difficulty happens is when we get very objective and very prescriptive and quantify, when it comes to exercise and nutrition, that's when the problems tend to occur. And that's what we often see in eating disorders in sport, because on the one hand, those certain traits can really make you excel as an athlete. If you apply those traits to the wrong aspects, that's when you tend to get into trouble.
So it's not to poo-poo or dismiss sometimes these natural personality traits that can allow you to excel in career or sports or any facet of life, but it's just, I guess, recognise that they can sway the other way, where they do start to be problematic rather than serve you positively.
That's right.
Okay, that's fantastic. I spoke just today, Emma, to an athlete who otherwise would have been representing the nation, Australia, at the Tokyo Olympic Games, right about now, and she has in the past had her own psychological battles, and her comment was that this current status we're in as we're recording through this COVID pandemic, that it had allowed her to just stop trying to control things and just to basically let go and have fun and be a human. They were her words. Are you finding that that's one of the byproducts of the world's current state with your work?
Yeah, I think anecdotally, talking to different clinicians and athletes, I think when we talk about resilience, we talk about adversity and how we cope with that and how we manage that. And I think if we have a positive mindset, we can view it as opportunities and opportunities to learn. And I think that being able to control the controllable.
So that was Dr. Emmett Mystery, episode 229, Expert Edition, coming in as the 9th most downloaded Expert Edition of 2020. Now for the 8th most downloaded Expert Edition, and that is none other than the founder of today's show sponsor, Endure IQ, Dr. Dan Plews. And on episode 213, Heat Training and Acclimation for the Endurance Athlete, Dr. Dan Plews shared how athletes can best prepare to race in the heat and reverse engineer their training to ensure the best performance come race day. Topics explored included heat stress, the physiological adaptations of heat training, heat as a training tool, active and passive heat training strategies, and the fascinating concept of why the perception of heat is so key in our performance. And here's a little snippet of Dr. Dan Plews, founder of Endure IQ, and himself the world record holder for the fastest age group finish at the Hawaii Ironman World Triathlon Championships, sharing around cooling strategies and this concept of why our perception of heat is so important to our performance. Is there any practical tips you can share around best ways to stay cool, and does it matter?
Yeah. So in this module for the course, we've got Dr. Chris Stevens, he did his PhD in the area of slushy, so slurry ingestion, so drinking slushy, and he's kind of a real pre-cooling expert. So don't want to step on his toes too much, but I can give it a bit of a crack on what I know. So there are many cooling strategies. Some are obviously more effective than others. Some of the ones that that have been shown to be the most effective of recent years is the ingestion of cold beverages is a major one. more recently, people have suggested that slushy ingestion, so actual ice, is even more effective at cooling. So I don't know, like my good friend, Professor Paul Lawson, he invented the flow bottle, which was basically a bottle that's designed to put ice slushy into, like, to drink it on the go. But it's, there's just the practicalities of it are really, really hard, because it's really hard to keep it cool, and by the time you get to it, it's hard. I mean, the bottle is designed itself to keep cool, but it's quite a hard thing to do practically. So with the slushy, it's been shown that it is an effective way of cooling pre and during, and it's to do with the phase change of ice to water. So it's called the enthalpy of fusion, and it draws heat basically, and can cool the core and cool you down. Also, even cooling of the mouth rinsing cold fluids has been shown to make you feel a lot cooler. And in the end of the day, perception of heat is absolutely everything. If you feel cooler, you will perform better. And that's where all this stuff comes in, which is, even some of the menthol rubs, menthol swirling has been shown to have an effect. So drinking menthol fluids and spitting it out, that's another way that you can be effective. But these are all attempts to either cool the inside of your mouth, cool the skin. Cooling the skin is absolutely critical.
So there's a core temperature and also the skin temperature considerations, but that key statement, if you feel cooler, you will perform better. And those ice vests, Dan, obviously the Tokyo Olympic Games are on hold or pushed out a year at the moment, but if I think about triathlon, the blue vests, and I know you've had experience with these working with New Zealand rowing there, these vests, are they seemingly are used a lot. Is that just an attempt to reduce the perception of heat?
Yeah, so, I mean, they do reduce the perception of heat. And again, it comes back to the practicalities of their use. So I've never been too much of a fan of them, but it depends on, I haven't looked at any of the new recent innovations in that space. And the idea is that with all these things, the pre-cooling stuff, it's all to do, we talked about the heat sink and the acclimation response, but you're trying to further increase the heat sink. So another one could be getting in a tub of cold water just before and cooling the core temperature right down, because your heat sink, you're trying to increase the heat sink, the pre-cooling, making yourself, so you're starting with a lower core temperature, which is important for long duration endurance events. For something like kayak that I'm involved with, it doesn't really matter too much. They're done in 2 minutes and they're not gonna get hot enough. But a marathon or something like that, you want to have that. You want to really be as cool as you can when you start on the core, but also have warm muscles. So you're kind of marrying up these two things, right? Which is where the ice vests come in, because you can still do a warm up.
Yes.
You can move the muscles. You can keep the muscles hot, but keep the core cold, which is what you're trying to achieve overall.
So if you missed episode 213 featuring Dr. Dan Plews, heat training and acclimation for the endurance athlete, be sure to jump back and enjoy the full episode. Now, coming in as the 7th most downloaded expert edition for 2020, we have Dr. Ebony Rio. Given the large body of endurance athletes that follow the show, each year we like to bring an expert on to discuss contemporary approaches to the rehabilitation and management of tendinopathy or tendon-related injuries. And this year, Dr. Ebony Rio, Senior Research Fellow, Sports Physiotherapist, gave us a 2020 tendinopathy rehabilitation update on episode 222. And here are the top 3 mistakes that Dr. Ebony Rio sees athletes making when it comes to the rehabilitation of their tendinopathies.
Okay, let me see how I go. So the top thing that we see that people have gone wrong with is actually differential diagnosis. So Jill and I joke around that for a tendon clinic, we don't see many tendons, because most of the people that we see have been put on this path, you have tendinopathy, therefore you do, X, Y, Z, and why aren't you better? And with no ability to sort of, meet the person at their story. So to give you the example of my runner with a peritendon issue. So that's going to bring me to my next point. So I'm going to combine these 2 points. You have to care about tendon load, and you have to care about how that impacts differential diagnosis. So really quickly, we think of tendons like a spring. If you're doing it fast, that's high tendon load, so that's, running for the Achilles. We can think of tendons being compressed against bone. So if your Achilles, if you drop back into, dorsiflexion, your tendon's compressed, which is why if you have an insertion issue, you'll hate being in bare feet. It's because of their compression. Combining tension and compression is like pushing off from a dorsiflex position. And then our last load is that sliding and gliding load of that outside sheath over the tendon. So this is where differential diagnosis and listening to your patient's story is critical. So this athlete came in, okay, do you have any morning pain and stiffness? No. Well, my antenna's up because that is a hallmark sign of Achilles tendinopathy. Does your tendon warm up? No, it gets worse the longer that I run. Well, my antenna's up because that is a hallmark of tendinopathy, that warm-up phenomenon. Whereas something like a peritendon issue, if your endurance is not good, as you foot strike, you start to just go through more range. So it's not about the rate of loading, it becomes that sort of repetition. And he was also irritated cycling because he was just going through repeated dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. But a tendinopathy will never be bothered by cycling because that's not a spring load. So the key thing that we see is that people carry their diagnosis with them. They come and tell you, I have Achilles tendinopathy, and I strip that right back. I don't care how many people you've seen. In fact, the more people you've seen, the longer I spend picking it apart. Because, the guy that has a peritendon issue shouldn't be given calf raises. He's not going to go well. So I think understanding load is then so important because you then can give people what their start loads are and what their safe loads are. So it's important for differential but also for your start point. So I've combined those two. Is that okay?
Absolutely. So the differential diagnosis, making sure you are dealing with a tendon first and foremost, and that can be best reflected upon by understanding the load, the story that the athlete, the patient is sharing.
Yeah, and the final thing for me is if you go and see a clinician, so you have a lot of runners listening to your podcast, is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. So if you go and see a clinician, what I want you to really challenge them on is how they came up with your diagnosis. So the third thing relates to, for me, that's so important, I'm so passionate about this, how we attribute a name to something. So, for example, if you have Achilles pain and I squeeze your Achilles, actually you can't differentiate from the sheath issue, from Achilles tendinopathy, from a sural nerve irritation. There's actually about 9 things that it could be if that person's just squeezed your Achilles. Now, similarly for all your runners out there, if you're being sent for any imaging, it's probably unhelpful. Kevin Lieberthal showed that you have changes in your Achilles in asymptomatic runners based on how many years you've been running. So it's all load-related change. So we don't need to panic about these, but they're also not diagnostic of your condition. They're a load-related change that was, probably been there for years and will be there for the rest of your life of no consequence. So palpation, not diagnostic, imaging, not diagnostic. So just really challenging people on, okay, so you've told me I've got Achilles tendinopathy. Why do you think that, and what do I need to do about it? And just making sure you're really involved in those decisions.
So that was Dr. Ebony Rio, episode 220, 2020 Tendinopathy Rehabilitation Update, coming in as the 7th most downloaded expert edition. Now, in 6th position, we have endurance coaching legend, none other than Joe Friel, co-founder of Training Peaks. He's known as the triathlon coach of coaches and a multi-endurance sports author, sharing his career learnings on episode 218. And this really was an episode for the ages. And one of the topics that really struck a chord was when I asked Joe to share the top 3 mistakes that he sees endurance athletes making. What are the top 3 mistakes? It's a broad question you see endurance athletes making.
Yeah, it's kind of the same things that have been the same things as long as I've been in sport. Number one, I see athletes training too much. And that doesn't necessarily mean how many days per week or how many workouts they do or how many hours, but everything has always got to be more. And that's the biggest mistake they make. For example, when I would coach somebody and write their programs for them for the first few weeks, I would quite often, and this is a very common comment I got from them, was after a few weeks they would tell me they're doing a lot less training now than they were before when they were self-coached. And yet, almost invariably, these athletes would race better. I was pretty good at getting them to the starting line ready to have a good race, even though they were doing less training, less volume is what they were looking at. How much volume are they doing? They were doing less volume than they were before. They were doing extremely well as far as performance. For example, I had one athlete who was a pro triathlete. This is back late 90s, early 2000s. And he was training to make the Olympic team, the U.S. Olympic team for the 2000 games in Sydney. He made the team eventually for the U.S., but he kept winding up with upper respiratory infections, which was really setting us back. And so finally, I cut his training way back. I cut him back to like 17, 18 hours a week of training, whereas other pros, at least in those days, were training more like 30 hours a week who were getting ready for the Olympics. And so I cut him back to really a handful of hours, but we made sure everything he did had a purpose and was focused on qualifying. And he did qualify and had a great race that day. And I just couldn't train him the way that most of the pros were doing it. But he still did extremely well. So that's number one. The biggest mistake most athletes make is they just do too much. I don't care what we talk about. It's always too much. I can get athletes to perform much better if we just get smarter. If we do the right things, it's just doing a bunch of stuff, they'll do much better. The second thing kind of fits in with that one. They just don't take enough rest. Their easy days are not easy enough. Their easy days are too hard. Trying to get an athlete to go easy is one of the hardest things there is in the world of coaching. That's about the biggest challenge there is. The athlete always wants to go a little bit harder than they should. I ride with athletes here where I live from time to time, and I found it's impossible to do an easy ride with a group of athletes or even one more athlete. They just can't go easy. They don't know what that word means, really. So it's just a real challenge that athletes just don't take enough rest. They don't make their easy days easy enough. They try to make their easy days moderately hard, and that means that their hard workouts become moderately hard. So nothing becomes really hard anymore. Everything kind of moves toward the middle, and you don't make much progress when everything's in the middle. You have to be doing either hard workouts or easy workouts, trying to avoid all the stuff in the middle, which is this thing we've been talking about now for more than 15 years, this polarization of training. Steven Seiler came up with back in the early 2000s. That's what we all need to be doing, but I can't get, athletes just don't want to do that. They do not want to go easy. And the third thing is they don't get enough sleep. This is one of the biggest challenges I've run into in coaching athletes was they just don't get enough sleep. I would get athletes coming to me always who had very high goals. I never got an athlete coming to me saying that their goal was to finish a local 5K. I never got that athlete. I always got the athlete who wanted to qualify for Kona, who wanted to be on this podium at a national championship, who wanted to achieve these tremendous, very high goals. And so the first thing, knowing this was going to be extremely difficult for them to do, was I had to get into how much sleep are they getting, because that's really key. It really wasn't so much their training, it's how much sleep they get is the big issue. Because when you sleep, that's when these anabolic hormones are released into your body, these tissue building hormones. So all the workout does is give you the potential for fitness. The workout doesn't give you fitness. It only creates potential for fitness. The potential is realized during sleep. And so if the athlete's not getting enough sleep, which I found is extremely common among everybody in the U.S., I'm sure in Australia also, probably in the Western Hemisphere, I'm positive of that too, go to Europe or wherever, we would find the same thing, that people are just not getting enough sleep. Athletes they've pack too much into their days. The typical triathlete has got a pool session, a master swim at 5 o'clock in the morning or 5:30, something like that. And so they got to get up at 4:30 in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning to make it to that. And then they work all day. You get home at night, spend time with the family, and the next thing you know, after watching TV and so forth, checking email, it's 11 o'clock, and they go to bed, and they got to get up the next morning at 4. So they get 5 hours of sleep. And so what have they done? They just shortchanged their fitness. They've just taken away all the value of the workouts they did that day is greatly reduced. So that was always my biggest challenge. And so I would tell the athletes, and I've said this so many times, I'm sure that people who are listening have already heard me say this once before. I would tell my athletes who had these extremely high goals that they could have only 3 things in their life. They could have their family, they could have their career, and they could have training. They cannot become members of their local homeowners association. They cannot volunteer to work for a nonprofit organization. They can't take up playing golf. There's all these sorts of things they can't do. Their neighbors may be doing and having a great deal of fun with. But if you're trying to qualify for Kona, you're trying to get on the podium in a national championship, you can't do all those things. We got to get sleep. And what everybody does is when they add something to their life that just takes time, where that time comes from is sleep. So they cut out an hour or 2 hours of sleep so they could fit in one more thing in their day. And so that I found was actually the key to helping athletes achieve their goals, was to make sure they simply just got enough sleep. So that's the 3 things I would suggest are the big 3 from my coaching experience.
So if you are an endurance athlete, coach, or practitioner in the field and you missed episode 218 featuring Joe Friel, then jump over and add it to your playlist today. Now, coming in as the 5th most downloaded expert edition for 2020, we have Chris Bremer, UK-based physiotherapist, running biomechanics researcher, sharing around biomechanics of the running athlete on episode 223. This really was a very popular expert edition in 2020, and it's one of those episodes that you need to go back and listen to 2 or 3 times with a pen to capture the many learnings that Chris shared. And during the episode, I asked Chris the commonly discussed topic of foot strike for athletes and the big question of whether one foot strike type is better than another. Here's Chris's reply, as well as some further comments around biomechanics for the running athlete.
Yeah, so foot strike is a really great topic. So, people fit into 2 camps out there. Well, not necessarily 2 camps, but there are 2 strong polarized camps. Those people who say we should all be running like 4 foot, and those people who say that, it doesn't matter. And the reality is your foot strike and whether or not that links to injury really doesn't matter. So running on your heels isn't wrong, and running on your forefoot isn't wrong. What happens is that these 2 extremes of a movement pattern, they influence the stress on the body in completely different ways. So if you land on your heel, you've probably got more stress that's going through the knee and the quadriceps. And if you land on your toes, you've got more stress that's going through your calf and your Achilles complex and your foot. Now, those stresses themselves don't necessarily get you injured, and are not going to explain why everybody gets these different types of injuries. Really, we should be able to adapt our tissues to respond to running on your heel or running on your toes. And I think the biggest injury risk actually comes from these beliefs that one foot strike is a right way to run. Because when people fall into this camp that they believe that running on your forefoot is going to solve the world of all its running-related injury problems, and they try and convince all of these people to switch from landing on their heels to their toes, it shifts the load completely. So you go from having relatively low stress at your calf to masses of stress on your calf. And in a large proportion of cases, that is the thing that gets you injured, is the changing of the foot strike pattern. But fundamentally, this whole concept of one foot strike being correct over the other is based on very weak evidence, and it's almost non-existent, this evidence. It is essentially it's a bias that's formed by some people to believe that one foot strike is better than the other.
So, sorry, Chris, the evidence is weak. The biases can be strong, and something I find myself clinically often educating runners around is don't try and manipulate your foot in any way. Let it do its thing. Is that sound advice, Chris?
Yeah. I don't believe in trying to change the position that people land on the foot or change the angle of the foot. I think more of the key things are just getting the foot close to your center of mass. So whether or not that is on your toes or it's on your heel, just let it do what it naturally wants to do in that respect, because it will have adapted from years and years to develop the structural integrity to cope with that way of running. And you simply changing that is almost asking what your body's naturally adapted to do from birth to do something completely different in, like, you know, for me, like all of a sudden asking it to do something completely different is in my 30s. You know, I've got a lot of unraveling to do there.
So if you missed episode 223 featuring Chris Bremer, Biomechanics for the Running Athlete, it's a must to add to your playlist. Plenty of incredible learnings to be had that will allow you to cut through the maze and the endless conversation around running technique, what we need to focus on and what we do not need to focus on. Support for today's show comes from the great folk at Endure IQ and their recently released Endure IQ Training Squad. If you're an endurance athlete ready to take charge of your performance with proven training programs and workouts adjustable to your needs, then the Endure IQ Training Squad is here to help. It's a training hub where athletes have access to a training calendar consisting of a selection of world-class training plans and scalable workouts from a credible source with proven results. And that credible source is none other than Dr. Dan Plews, our 8th most popular downloaded expert edition for 2020. Sign up to Endure IQ's weekly newsletter, The Brew Up, before the end of January 2021, and you'll be in the draw to win one of 3 premium training squad memberships free for a month. To sign up, jump over to endurieiq.com. And I have to say, I'm a subscriber to the weekly Brew Up newsletter, and it is perhaps the most look forward to email I receive each week. In it, Dr. Dan shares around what he's listening to, technology that has grabbed his attention, and what he's reading, a top workout, and a research finding from the literature. So be sure to jump over to endurieiq.com and subscribe to the Brew Up. Support for today's show also comes from the Physical Performance Show's Learnings membership, where if you'd like to support the production of the show, you can do so over at Patreon. Just search the Physical Performance Show Patreon, and for just $5 per month, you can become a much-loved patron of the show. And in return, we'll grant you free access to our back catalogue of live stream events and free access to all upcoming 2021 and beyond live stream events as well. And finally, support for today's show comes, as always, from Pogo Physio's online telehealth consultations designed to help endurance athletes get back to their physical best if they're suffering from tendon, bone, or joint-related concerns. To schedule your 45-minute online telehealth consultation, jump over to pogophysio.com.au, and there you can gain access to services with myself or any of the Pogo Physio team. For now, let's jump back and continue the countdown for the top 10 most downloaded expert editions of 2020. And coming in 4th position, we have Professor Peter Rayburn, who shared on all things maximising health for the Masters athlete on episode 215. This episode really struck a chord with so many listeners, of course, with Masters athletes being defined as 35 years plus athletes. During the episode, Professor Rayburn shared around successful aging, the physiology of the Masters or aging athlete, protein synthesis rates, strength training, thermal tolerance, perception of recovery, and the physiological changes that take place as we age as athletes. Here's a snippet from my conversation with Professor Peter Rayburn on episode 215, released in May. So what did you find through your PhD about the aging and slowing athlete?
Probably 2 critical things. 4 years of my life for 2 critical things. But number 1 was that there is a significant decrease in muscle mass as we get older. And we observed that by getting a group of older distance runners. I call them lifetime runners. And also that was endurance athletes, and a group of older lifetime sprint runners very rare group of animals, and we age matched. Training matched, training volume matched, training intensity matched, and body weight matched with young, similarly trained athletes. And we found a significant decrease in muscle mass, which, as you'll appreciate, contributed to a decrease in strength. And in older endurance athletes, we found a decrease in the maximum heart rate, which is age-related and we can't do a bloody thing about it, was the major means by which endurance decreased, their endurance capacities decreased. So they were probably the two big findings.
And it's interesting because you in many ways you'd expect or assume that you'd come out with something like that, but the science still has to be done, right?
Exactly right, Brad. And I am a big believer that, coaches and athletes are probably common sense wise and experience wise know why these decreases are occurring. Critically, with the decrease in muscle mass, we then did a muscle biopsy and found that it was the type 2 muscle fibre, the fast twitch muscle fibre, that decreased in size. And that would suggest, on the old fibre recruitment theory, when fast twitch muscle fibres are recruited with high intensity exercise, that weight training might be able to assist us there, and higher intensity training might be able to assist us there.
I mean, if you fast forward from your PhD days to, your current academic tenure, it's fairly well absorbed and adopted, isn't it, that strength and conditioning work is just key for really anyone that's breathing.
And as you know, and most of our listeners would know, resistance training, whether it be body weight or whether it be in the gym, anything where we resist the muscles and overload the muscles is going to lead to positive changes. And increasingly now, and definitively now, we've known for a long time that speed athletes need weight training, but we now know through a lot of research, primarily from a guy called Ronestad in Scandinavia, that weight training, including heavyweight training, in a periodised way, leads to improvements in endurance performance. I've extrapolated that in older athletes, based on their decrease in muscle mass, that it's even more important for older athletes to help maintain speed and not have the decrease in speed be as great by not doing weight training. And we've also now conclusively shown about 3 years ago through a big PhD study by one of my PhD guys called Luke Del Vecchio, that in older cyclists, that we get an improvement in speed and maintenance of endurance by dropping 2 of their road cycling training sessions and having it as resistance training sessions. They can maintain their endurance and improve their speed. A great win for a road cyclist.
So that was Professor Peter Rayburn on episode 215, our 4th most downloaded expert edition for 2020, sharing around maximising health and performance for Masters athletes. Now, we're down to our top 3 most downloaded expert editions for 2020. And in third place, on the podium if you like, with the bronze, is multi-featured expert on episode 219, none other than Dr. Stephen Seiler, sharing around COVID training and marathon training considerations. And of course, when Dr. Stephen Seiler stops by the Physical Performance Show, there are plenty of snippets that we could share that grabbed attention. But here's one that tied in nicely with the live stream event that Dr. Stephen Seiler brought us, Sustainable Training for Attainable Endurance Goals. And this is Dr. Seiler sharing around why it's so important that we must find a sustainable workload. You so eloquently stated it back on episode 172, avoiding that intensity black hole, the middle zone where you're too tired to truly make it count as a hard, intense session. and you're too impatient to go steady, and we keep chasing squirrels. So probably a good little recap of your some of your work on episode 172.
Yeah, and the chasing squirrels part is something that I got from another, someone else, which I just loved. I think it was somebody that tweeted. He said he was referring to something I'd written. He says, yeah, I always start out with those good intentions. And he was referring to Zwift, being on this massive online cycling platform. And he says, I start out with great intentions, and then all of a sudden I see, a sign sprint or a segment or someone cycles past me, and there I go chasing squirrels, and for me, it was a great metaphor, because I'm kind of a country boy, and I understood, the idea of the dog that just cannot help but chase the squirrel, which it will not catch. It will not achieve the goal ever. And so it's futile. And unfortunately, the human brain, particularly the male human brain, I would almost argue, is easily pulled into that in the training atmosphere.
Oh, for sure. And no more so than on bikes, I've observed and witnessed over the years. And, you also state, be disciplined, know what the goal or the target is for the day, and stick to it. And one of those famous Stephen Seiler adages, know the plan and then work the plan. And, that certainly still applies to what has been this big shift, most of the regions of the world to indoor training, right?
Definitely. And there's been, I'm glad to see that some countries, some areas, including my own, are coming out of this, but many are still in the middle of it. And so there is at least still a tendency for there to be a much bigger proportion of our total training is being performed indoors. For some athletes, like swimmers, they're not able to swim still. So the modality of training is also getting shifted towards what is available most indoors at home, and that is tending to be cycling. So there's been a big increase in the amount of cycling time relative to the total distribution for both multi-sport athletes, but also for athletes that would normally be swimmers or runners that have just been prevented from doing that. So that's been interesting. And I got some hard data on this way back in March, and that was the clear trend, was that cycling was the preferred modality. It was available. And so then you're getting on these platforms that are by their very nature kind of conducive to competition. They're great. You have group rides. I don't know if you're familiar with these. I don't want to single out Zwift, but it is kind of the dominant platform. There are others. And the Zwift platform, which is really catering to the pros, to the best athletes and that. And so it's fun. You get to ride. I've ridden with Cadell Evans and other big stars, when I say with, I mean, I was in the game at the same time they were, So,
that's a width, Stephen.
That's a width in my book, I'm taking it. So, but it is so easy to just, to swing above your average. You get so drawn into this stuff, and that's fine sometimes. But if it's happening every day, then it will have consequences. It'll drag you down,
There was a lot of Twitter activity going from the Dr. Stephen Seiler account in requesting data. And one of the sets you grabbed between the 26th of March and the 3rd of April, you had 1,078 responses. And that is where, as you just said, that there was this adoption from other athletes, swimmers even, towards cycling, and more cycling from triathletes, for example, and lots of other things there that put cycling at the fore. But one of the things I have heard you comment on, Stephen, is that no athlete should be dragging themselves out of the basement at the moment, or through COVID, at the peak of some of the stress.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I have to think about what the context of that was, but I guess the issue that we were dealing with in March and April was that you have a lot of athletes that have, including my daughter, the only athlete I actually coach day to day, that had laid down these very clear plans. They had these milestone competitions that provide both motivation and structure in their whole year plan. And then all of a sudden they're gone, just woof, gone, up in smoke. And so then the athletes went through a period of just total confusion. What do I do now? And then a period of mourning, I would almost say, all this hard work and now for nothing. And then maybe the third phase was kind of just okay, let's make lemonade out of lemons here. What's what can I do? How can I make the most of this unexpected and for most people a very negative situation? And that's where, at least for a lot of athletes, maybe the answer was, I think, to not necessarily follow through the same degree of peaking, the same degree of, where you're really kind of sharpening and doing some of those really high intensity sessions towards a very specific race, because those races weren't there, and the cost of that peaking process on the body and on the brain is pretty high. And so being able to get yourself into a different mentality where you say, well, no, I can put in a new block of, let's call it gap closure, where I'm trying to look at my weaknesses as an athlete and use the opportunity provided by this unexpected season, change to improve certain weaknesses. That was something that I suggested, and I think probably others did too in this period. But the thing was to give yourself a break.
All right, so that was Dr. Stephen Seiler taking out the bronze on episode 219 on all things COVID training and marathon training considerations. Of course, jump back and check out the back catalogue with Dr. Stephen Seiler on episode 172, all things polarized training, and episode 226, where we shared some of the Q&A from the Dr. Stephen Seiler live stream event. Now, taking home the silver medal as the second most downloaded expert edition of 2020, we have UK-based sports endocrinologist Dr. Nikki Kay, who on episode 198 shared around hormones, health and performance. It was an incredibly popular episode. Dr. Nikki Kay reminded us why we don't get fitter when we're training, but why we get fitter when we're resting, when the hormones drive the adaptation. Here's a snippet of Dr. Nikki Kay sharing around that theme. I've heard you say in preparing for today that training's one thing. The athlete can do the training, that the performer, the dancer, can do the work, but it's the hormones, the milieu of the hormones, that determines the adaptations that ensue. So can you maybe do a little endocrinology 101?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's all about effective, efficient training, isn't it? Because, you can slog up and down the pool. Oh, I love swimming in the 50-metre pool in Sydney, by the way. Anyway, you have lots of 50-metre pools in Australia. I'm really super jealous. Anyway, you can put in all the training hours you want, but the reason you're training is because you become fitter, you become better next time you go to a training session or when you turn up to your race. But that's, what is actually driving those adaptations to exercise, and when do they occur? It's actually when you rest. So you go and do, say, a swim session, and it's actually then when you stop, within the 30-minute window, you have your carbohydrate and protein, of course, and you're going to have a rest, especially during sleep. Sleep and exercise are the two main stimuli, for example, for growth hormone release. And it's when you're resting that the hormones really snap into action. They've been sort of stimulated a little bit from your exercise. And there are the key hormones like growth hormone, many others, all the reproductive hormones also, by the way, not just for reproduction. We're talking testosterone and estrogen, of course, for the male and the female. Those, and why? What they do, the hormones go into the nucleus and they direct the expression of DNA to synthesize proteins. The proteins, in order to strengthen the muscles, all this sort of thing, make more enzymes so you can deal with lactic acid, all this sort of thing. So that's why, 2 points to this. You get fitter when you're actually resting, after a train. You've done your training. It's not whilst you're doing the training you're getting fitter. It's during the rest afterwards, the rest of recovery, sleep. And it's hand in hand because the hormones are snapping into action, bringing about all those adaptations so that when you turn up for your next session, you will be a little bit higher. So that's why the classic sort of graph of getting fitter, you actually sort of decrease in fitness actually while one should immediately once you've done your training, because the body's in a little bit of a state of a shock and a stress, but it's actually then it bounces back up when you're recovering so that the next time you train, you're fitter. So basically hormones drive the adaptations, and those adaptations occur during rest and recovery. So that's why athletes that's part of the training schedule. It's not the training, it's the training and the recovery. They have to go hand in hand.
So if you missed Dr. Nikki Kay on episode 198, Hormones, Health and Performance, be sure to jump back and add it to your playlist. But have a pen with you. There were plenty of learnings in episode 198. And of course, more recently, we hosted Dr. Nikki Kay again on episode 244 for an extension of the theme around hormones for health and performance, as Dr. Nikki Kay shared around hormones across our lifespan. That was episode 244 that followed our silver medal episode 198. All right, drum roll. It is time to reveal the most downloaded expert edition for 2020, and taking out the gold medal, the top step of the podium, is New Zealand-based author and exercise physiologist, Dr. Stacey Sims. And on episode 207, Dr. Stacey Sims, author of Raw, shared around female physiology and endurance training on the idea that women are not small men. Now, of course, it was an extremely popular episode, the most downloaded for 2020 in terms of expert editions. And just like any of our top 10 episodes, you really needed a pen and paper to capture the many learnings that Dr. Stacey Sims shared. Dr. Stacey discussed menopause, pregnancy, menstruation, the oral contraceptive pill, how women can best navigate their athletic recovery, their strength training, their fueling, all based on the different phases of their menstruation cycle. And here's Dr. Stacey Sims sharing around the physiological differences between female and male athletes. Just in broad brushstrokes, can you paint some of the sex differences physiologically from males to females?
Oh, broad brushstrokes.
or not so broad.
Yeah, I was going to say, so estrogen and progesterone are really thought to be like the inherent reproductive hormones, but they affect every system of the body, from increasing your core temperature in the high hormone phase. Progesterone increases more total body sodium losses, thirst sensation changes. We even know inherently in endurance exercise, there's a difference across the board of fuel utilization between men and women doing the same type of exercise, and like recovery differences. Women come back down to baseline a lot sooner, and things like plasma volume changes and blood volume changes across the menstrual cycle. Things like brain fog that comes up because estrogen is affecting serotonin and tryptophan. So there's so many things that people just generalize as, oh, well, you're a woman and you're PMS and you're going to be moody and anxious. And people are like, well, why am I? And they just accept it. Well, it's because these hormones are affecting every system in the body. So I would say that almost every stereotype you have of a woman somehow is based or entrenched in a hormonal or physiological response.
And there's so much we could delve into there on the sex differences, and I'd encourage listeners, grab your copy of Raw, the book, and explore them in detail. But you mentioned there that there's an acceptance and a generalization of some of these effects that you just mentioned there, Stacey. So I guess you're challenging convention by saying it doesn't have to be accepted, rather you can optimize a woman's performance around their physiology.
Exactly. And with an eye to Tokyo, right, everyone's doing all this heat research. But I have seen very limited studies coming out that are specific to the female athletes. But we know from a study 2 years ago, it was published by, I think her first name was Cynthia, her last name is Me, that women need a primer. They need to be exposed to heat first to drive the temperature up a bit. and then exit the heat and then go back in order to get these same adaptations that men get just by being in. So there's small little subtle effects because your core temperature and all your thresholds of thermoregulation change across the menstrual cycle. So if you're in the low hormone phase where those changes haven't occurred, your body needs a little bit of a stimulus to actually turn up and get responsive to heat exposure. And when you're looking at the standard protocols right now for acclimation to heat and humidity, they're all based on the male model, where the women aren't getting the cardiovascular boosts of blood volume or getting the thermoregulatory changes and shifts in sweating onset because they're not doing the right protocol for their physiology.
So there you have it, our top 10 most downloaded expert editions for 2020. A massive congratulations to the guests who featured in the top 10, but of course, a huge extension of thanks to the very generous experts that have shared right across the calendar year. We all know that we take so much from their generous sharings as they feature on the show. And just because they may not have featured in the top 10 doesn't mean their information is any less valuable or interesting. A huge thanks, as always, to the great folk who make this show possible. They've continued to make it possible throughout the 2020 calendar year despite the challenges that we've all faced, and that is Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, and Matthew Alding on all things show graphic design. Now, if you'd like to jump over to the show notes for this episode, there you'll find links to each of the featured guests that made our top 10 most downloaded expert editions for 2020, as well as various YouTube videos and helpful resources that accompany each of those episodes. Keep the podsies coming over on social media. You can find the show at Physical Performance Show and tag the show in with a podsie, a screenshot of the episode that you're enjoying. You can find the show now over on YouTube, where we syndicate the show each and every week as it goes live. And of course, don't forget the Physical Performance Show's Learnings membership if you would like to support the production of the show over at Patreon. Just search Patreon, The Physical Performance Show. Podcasts, of course, are free to download and enjoy. However, they are not free to produce. A massive thanks to Endure IQ for their continued support of the show. Don't forget to jump over to enduriq.com and subscribe to their weekly newsletter, The Brew Up, where Dr. Dan Plews gives his weekly top 5, anything from latest science and tech to workouts of the week. So that's the final episode for 2020. However, on next week's episode, we do our top 10 countdown for the most downloaded featured performer episodes for 2020. Following that, we spring back with a new calendar year with a bunch of expert editions around topics including mental skills for athletic performance, navigating nasal obstruction and why that's so important for our health and performance with Dr. Dan Robinson. And then in 2021, we kick off the year with an array of expert editions that really will have you being set up for your physical best performance. We'll bring you conversations with Rory Darkin's mental skills coach around mental skills for athletes. We'll navigate nasal obstruction and discover why that is so important to overcome for our health and also our performance with ear, nose and throat surgeon Dr. Dan Robinson. And we chat with Inigo Mujica, arguably the world's preeminent expert when it comes to all things endurance sports tapering. So get set for a bumper 2021 and be sure to be tuning in next week for our top 10 countdown of our featured performers. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer and this has been the Physical Performance Show.